On certain rail lines that run through quiet regions, the overnight shift develops its own strange rhythm. It is a world defined by mechanical repetition and the heavy silence of the landscape. Stations are dimly lit, their yellow sodium lamps casting long, distorted shadows across damp platforms. Passenger numbers are low, often consisting of weary shift workers or individuals retreating into the anonymity of the night. The train moves through darkness for long stretches, and the only sounds are the rhythmic hum of the rails, a metallic heartbeat, and the occasional automated announcement echoing through mostly empty cars, its voice sounding increasingly detached from reality as the hours pass. For conductors working these routes, routine becomes the most important tool for survival. Faces become familiar, patterns become predictable. They learn to read the subtle language of the carriage, the smell of stale coffee, the condensation on the windows, the specific creak of a door, which is why the anomaly stood out immediately. It was not a sudden shock, but a gradual realization that the geometry of the routine had been compromised. Near the rear of the train, in the third carriage from the end, a man had begun appearing every night. He always sat in the same seat, seat 17. He always boarded before the conductor reached the carriage, and he was never seen leaving. At first, the observation seemed trivial. Overnight commuters often followed rigid habits born of exhaustion or necessity. Some passengers rode long distances while sleeping, their heads lolling against the cold glass. Others simply avoided interaction, burying themselves in books or stares. But what drew the conductor's attention was not the man's quiet behavior. It was the absolute absence of any variation. Every night, the same posture, the same seat, the same lack of luggage. Even the most habitual commuter eventually shifts their weight, checks their watch, or unbuttons a coat. This man remained as static as the upholstery. The conductor noted a subtle, persistent chill in the air around row 17. A drop in temperature that the train's heating system seemed unable to compensate for. There was also a faint metallic scent, like ozone or old iron, that lingered specifically in that section of the carriage. The line itself had a long operational history, running through several industrial towns that had gradually emptied over the decades. Passenger volume had dropped significantly, leaving late-night routes half-occupied at best. In such conditions, train staff often develop a strong memory for regular travelers. Yet, when the lead conductor, a veteran of 22 years named Elias, questioned his colleagues, none of them recalled the man. "Seat 17 is always empty on my logs," one junior conductor insisted. "I walked through that car 10 minutes ago," another said, frowning. There was no one there but a sleeping nurse in the front row. This detail triggered a procedural response. Transit operators rely on passenger logs, electronic ticket records, and station entry data to track ridership. When Elias checked the digital manifest after several consecutive nights of observation, the result was unusual. There was no ticket associated with seat 17. There was no boarding scan from any of the preceding stations. No station entry record matched the man's presence. In isolation, such errors can occur. Systems fail. Sensors miss a rapid stride. Tickets are sometimes purchased manually and not yet synced. But the absence repeated itself across multiple nights with mathematical precision. Each time the conductor checked his handheld scanner, the seat appeared as unassigned. From a behavioral perspective, Elias's reaction followed a common cognitive pathway. Pattern recognition followed by verification. Humans are naturally inclined to confirm irregularities once attention has been drawn to them. The more consistent the anomaly appears, the stronger the urge becomes to investigate. He began to keep a private log, noting the exact second he encountered the passenger. Night 4. Passenger present. Posture. Static. Gaze. Fixed on window. Temperature at seat. 14 degrees Celsius. Carriage. Average. 21 degrees Celsius. Night 7. Attempted verbal contact. No response. Passengers' clothing appears to be of a heavy wool material, dark gray, unreactive to the train's internal drafts. What began as professional curiosity gradually turned into a mild, pervasive sense of unease. It was the uncanny valley effect. The man looked human. He sat like a human. But he lacked the kinetic noise that defines living beings. The next step involved reviewing archival incident records related to the rail line. Transportation authorities keep extensive logs of accidents, delays, and operational disruptions. Elias accessed the historical database at the central depot to check whether anything significant had ever occurred along this specific route. The search produced a result dated exactly 2 decades earlier. A derailment. 20 years before the present observations, a night train traveling along the same line had left the tracks during a violent autumn storm. The accident had been relatively small compared to major rail disasters, but it had still resulted in several fatalities. Investigators at the time concluded that track instability, caused by a flash flood, combined with excessive speed, were responsible. Among the passengers listed in the fatality report was a man named Julian Vane. The report included a black and white identification photo. Elias felt a jolt of recognition that was almost physical. The face in the photo was the face in seat 17. The report further specified that Vane had been found pinned under the wreckage of the third carriage. His assigned seat? Seat 17. At this point, it becomes important to separate perception from conclusion. Human cognition is extremely vulnerable to narrative construction. Once 2 pieces of information appear connected, a repeated passenger and a historical fatality, the mind begins building a story that links them together. Psychologically, this is known as pattern completion. However, Elias was a man of procedure. His reaction was less about supernatural interpretation and more about resolving a breach in reality's logic. The following night, Elias decided to observe the passenger more closely, employing the techniques he had been taught for identifying suspicious behavior. Behavioral observation in such environments often focuses on 3 primary indicators: body posture, movement patterns, and responsiveness to authority figures. The man's posture remained consistent with previous nights. He sat upright but slightly forward, hands resting loosely on his knees. His gaze was directed toward the window, though the darkness outside offered nothing but a reflection of the interior. Importantly, there were no signs of fatigue. Passengers riding late trains often display clear markers of tiredness, slumped shoulders, closed eyes, or the micro-movements of shifting positions to find comfort. This individual remained still for extended periods, displaying what psychologists might describe as passive attentiveness. Elias approached slowly. He noticed that the sound of his own boots on the linoleum floor seemed to muffle as he got closer to row 17. The air grew dense. In most cases, even passengers attempting to avoid detection will show subtle behavioral cues when approached by a conductor, adjusting posture, reaching for pockets, or initiating eye contact to gauge the official's intent. These micro-movements reflect anticipatory stress. The man did none of these things. He remained motionless until Elias stood directly beside him, the cold emanating from the seat now sharp enough to make the conductor's skin prickle. "Ticket, please," Elias said, his voice sounding thin in the heavy air. The passenger did not respond. After several seconds, the man slowly turned his head. Elias later described the moment not as frightening, but as strangely neutral. The man's facial expression lacked the usual emotional micro-signals that appear during human interaction. There was no confusion, no irritation, no acknowledgement of authority, just quiet, vacant attention. His eyes, though focused on Elias, didn't seem to register him as a physical obstacle. Later that night, Elias reviewed the security footage. Modern trains are equipped with high-definition interior cameras that continuously monitor passenger areas. The footage confirmed that the man had indeed been sitting in seat 17 for the entire recorded segment of the journey. But something else stood out, something that defied technical explanation. At no point did the footage capture him boarding. The camera positioned at the carriage entrance showed every other passenger entering during station stops. The footage showed the empty seat at one station, and then, after a brief flicker of static, a digital artifact that lasted less than a millisecond, the seat was occupied. It was as if the man had not moved into the frame, but had been rendered into it. From a psychological standpoint, situations like this place investigators in an unusual cognitive environment. Evidence appears to conflict with normal expectations of reality. When this happens, professionals often rely on elimination reasoning, removing all possible explanations before considering the impossible. Investigators from the Transit Authority's security wing were quietly brought in. They first considered technical explanations. Camera malfunction, a repeating loop of old footage, discarded. The background passengers were current. Timestamp errors, discarded. The sync with the train's GPS was perfect. Incomplete recordings, discarded. System diagnostics showed 100% health. For several nights, the pattern repeated. Same seat, same posture, same lack of recorded entry. Eventually, the authorities sanctioned a direct intervention. 2 transit officers, trained in crisis management, boarded the train at the start of the route. They remained inside the carriage before any passengers arrived. Their goal was simple: observe seat 17 continuously. At departure from the terminal, the seat was empty. The officers sat 3 rows back, their eyes fixed on the spot. The train left the station and accelerated into the suburban sprawl. Several minutes into the journey, while the train was passing through a tunnel, the interior lights flickered, a common occurrence on older lines. One officer looked down at his clipboard for a fraction of a second. The other blinked as the light returned. The man was sitting there. Neither officer reported seeing him enter. There was no sound of a footfall, no rush of air from a moving body. He was simply present. The officers approached the passenger carefully. "Sir, we need to see some identification," the lead officer commanded, his hand resting near his radio. Once again, there was no verbal response. But this time, the man did something different. He slowly stood up. The movement was fluid, lacking the jerky adjustments of a human, using their muscles to fight the sway of a moving train. He walked toward the rear of the carriage with a steady, purposeful gait. The officers followed, keeping a safe distance. The man reached the connection door, the heavy, pressurized door that leads to the next car. He didn't reach for the handle. According to the official report, he simply passed through the door. When the officers pulled the door open seconds later, the next carriage was entirely empty. The air inside was freezing, and a thin layer of frost had formed on the interior of the windows, despite the season. Security footage from that section of the train showed the officers entering an empty car, looking confused. The man was nowhere to be found. After that night, the passenger was never seen again. The case file was eventually closed without an official explanation, classified under unresolved operational anomaly. But what makes the story persist in the whispers of the rail yards is not the possibility of the supernatural. It is the psychological environment created by consistent observation combined with incomplete understanding. Humans rely on predictable systems to interpret reality. Transportation networks, surveillance technology, and procedural investigations are all designed to eliminate uncertainty. When those systems align perfectly yet still produce an unanswered result, the effect is quietly disturbing.
Elias, the conductor, retired shortly after the incident. He described the experience not as a haunting, but as a thinning of the world. For months afterward, every late-night passenger seemed slightly unfamiliar to him. Every empty seat carried a faint suggestion of possibility, a reminder that the seats we occupy are only ours for a temporary duration. Cases like this reveal a fundamental truth about human psychology. Our minds are built to search for patterns, assign meaning, and resolve ambiguity. We want there to be a ghost, because a ghost is an explanation. The alternative, that our reality has glitches, that there are moments where the past and present simply overlap without reason. is far more terrifying. The most unsettling conclusion is not that something impossible occurred. It is that our understanding of ordinary events, the simple act of sitting on a train, may be far less complete than we assume. The rails continue to hum, the stations remain dimly lit, and seat 17 remains empty. Or at least, that is what the sensors say.